Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and I'm here with one of our faculty, Angel Cartagena, and we're going to talk about his book, and in particular, a chapter in his book focus on systems theory and applying Bowen family systems theory to race in the American church. So, Angel, I went through your book and, I've read probably 50, 60 different books on, race and, America and racial reconciliation. And honestly, I would put it in the top five that I've read. And, in the book itself, if it were an album, my favorite song would be Chapter 7, so to speak. I would put that in the greatest hits. For a variety of reasons. And, that's what I want to focus on is because I think that this framework that you're providing of applying, systems theory and Bowen family systems to race relations in the United States is really powerful, really useful. So maybe we could start off and you could talk about some of the key concepts of Bowen family systems theory. I know one of the key concepts is healthy differentiation versus enmeshment versus emotional cutoff. And, you can kind of see that in the diagram here. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how that's defined in Bowen family systems theory.
Absolutely. Well, before that, though, I want to say thank you, man, for being such a huge supporter of the book. That means the world to me that you think as highly as you do about it. With regards to systems thinking, the idea here is that there is no part of a system that can be evaluated apart from the system, but that also whatever part you evaluate, you have to take into consideration where it is in the system. And so this whole chapter that I wrote is based on Bowen family systems theory. We call it Bowen theory for short. The idea being is that we are all an ecosystem, right? All of us live in an ecosystem where one sneezes here and another one catches the cold over there. And so the whole idea is that America's tendency to be individualistic in their thinking hampers our ability to move forward as a country. And one of the areas where we have difficulties doing so is on the issue of racism and racial justice. Bowen's thing was this, that if there was what he called an identified patient, someone who was struggling in some way, that the cause of that struggle was not from inside of them, but it came from outside. And that what he posited is that a family is a system where whenever anxiety pops up, it makes its way across the family through what they call triangling, what he called triangling, which is that if two people are having conflict over this anxiety, the way that they try to deal with it is they bring in someone else. And Bowen's theory was that how you related to the system was going to dictate which of two primary roles you were going to take. One was either you were going to be differentiated, that is, you can separate your emotions from your thinking in such a way that whenever you make decisions of any type, those decisions will be based on your values and your principles. Someone fused, however, has a higher level of emotional reactivity to the anxiety. In other words, when the anxiety manifests itself, you're so tied into the system that basically you let it overtake you. And then enmeshment is kind of a consequence of being fused, in that part of how relationships sort of interact in the system is that two people in that system can become enmeshed. And enmeshment is where a relationship becomes so fused that that two things happen. One is that these two people have inappropriate boundaries or lack of boundaries between them. And then the second thing is that they set rigid boundaries with everyone outside of the system. And so you'll recall that in the book, the biblical example that I gave of this was Rebecca with her sons Jacob and Esau. She helped Jacob steal Esau's birthright. And that's her and Jacob having an enmeshed relationship, because the birthright should have gone to Esau. He was the oldest. And of course, the improper or the rigid boundaries with Esau is that she basically cut off Esau, and Esau and Jacob would eventually be cut off themselves. And so in a systems environment, when there is anxiety present in the system, you will essentially take one of two roles, differentiated or fused, and fused can get to the point where there's enmeshment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I think that, part of what to me was interesting is how you applied this to a lot of the race relations in the United States and how Christians have related. Because I think part of why this is powerful is you start talking about systems and people, that's just a general term and it's hard for people to wrap their brain around it. But whenever you talk about a family system as simple as a triangle, most people have heard of the term triangulation relationally. It's two people against one, a child and a parent against another parent, or uh, things along those lines where you have some sort of dysfunction that happens. But what was helpful whenever I read that is if you apply that type of framework and these tools towards what's happened in the United States and race relations, and to a certain extent this is kind of what you talked about in chapter 3 of your book, where you have some Christians that will become enmeshed with the Democratic Party platform and others that will become enmeshed with the Republican Party platform, and the same type of thing that happens with politically liberal ideology and politically conservative ideology,
Mm-hmm.
where rather than be differentiated as Christians, and saying, this is biblical, this isn't biblical, you kind of, you know, uh, swallow the whole thing, right? So, and you
Yeah,
talked about that in chapter 3 with, on one side, kind of over embracing, some things that may not necessarily align with the Bible on the way critical race theory sometimes works, versus some Christians, on the conservative side that are promoting Christian nationalism and elements of Christian nationalism. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you've seen that enmeshment happen, on Christians on both sides.
yeah. So it becomes critical for us as Christians to particularly understand that if you have a biblical concept of life, you would understand that emotions, first of all, should never be the thing that drives you, right? Romans 12:2, Paul said, "Do not be conformed any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by what? The renewing of your mind." He didn't say anything about the renewing of your emotions. And so, because we have the word that teaches us this, and we have the word as the values and the principles that we should live by, we should be able to evaluate everything accordingly and have sober thinking about it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who call themselves Christians, and a lot of them probably are, but they allow themselves to get swept up in the emotions of the moment. And so, for example, with critical race theory, I mean, think about the fact that it really took off as a force and as a source of division when George Floyd was murdered, right? So this is almost emotionally driven. Like, we're not thinking about clearly about critical race theory. We're just all making assumptions about what it is or what it can do and arguing about it. And the same on the conservative side, which is we have this sense of desperation, emotion that is coming forth because we see a certain way of life that's being lost here in the United States, and another way of life that's almost being pushed on us. And out of desperation, we're reaching for candidates and others, platforms that really do not go with the Word of God. You cannot, your attitude, if you as a Christian say, we need a sober, well thought of, well constructed immigration policy, you've got me on board. The minute you start talking about building walls or pointing fingers and saying all those people are criminals, now you've crossed the line. And for those of us who profess Christ, once again, we're forgetting all those passages in the scriptures that call us to love the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. So,
Right.
so enmeshment happens, I believe, when you have these emotions, but these emotions are tied again to anxiety. It's we have, and think about it, it's legitimate to be concerned, right? For those of us who are concerned about the diminishment of family, for example, in marriage, that's a valid concern. It's not valid, however, to allow yourself to have such a anxious response to it that you begin to embrace policies and ideologies that really go against what the Word of God teaches. So
Yeah.
we see this happening on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I've learned, from a counseling perspective, part of what you have to do to avoid enmeshment and, healthy differentiation is you have to learn kind of your own boundaries. You learn what you believe. You separate out the things that someone else might push on you. Um, and you kind of have that healthy differentiation. And the same thing needs to happen as you work with any ideology, right? So you have to go through the details of various policies, various, a lot of people throw out every aspect of critical race theory without even knowing anything of what they're talking about. You know what I'm saying?
Right,
So, and
right,
and the reality is that like, you know, maybe 80% of what they're talking about was like core tenets that were promoted by Promise Keepers, that almost all evangelicals, supported. And, I think so that's one thing is you got to press into the details. The other part is you got to think about the big picture. Like, the Bible puts certain emphases on things and throughout Christian history, whenever Christians were, following the Bible, they were known as people who loved the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. Um, that's not true for a lot of conservative Republicans. Not
right.
always, but I'm just saying. And so if you miss, the big picture of the Bible, that's significant, right? So
You know,
anyway, let's jump into some of these other things. So you have the emotional triangles in families. You usually
right.
have like a parent and you have a favored child and a problem child.
Mm-hmm,
And you use the example of Rebecca and Jacob, where Jacob and Rebecca are enmeshed, and then Esau is cut off.
mm-hmm.
And then usually you have often this second triangle, often where there will be a second parent that will be engaging with the problem favored child. So maybe you could talk a little bit about both, how emotional triangles work in families, but also how they often lead to a secondary triangle that kind of provides stabilization. And, you kind of, and this is kind of a picture of dysfunction, right?
Right, right.
So
Well,
maybe you
well,
could share a little bit about that. Yeah.
yeah, I actually share an example in a book that I really was sort of one of my favorite examples, only because when I read it, it's like, yeah, this pretty much explains it. So, take a mother who is cooking dinner. Her children are watching TV. They're all at peace. Everything's great. Dad comes in and he brings in all of his anxiety from work. He's had a rough day and he's just decided he's going to unload on mom. Now, mom can handle this in either a differentiated way or a fused way. So let's talk about the fused way since that's the negative way. What she'll do now is, in order to ease the tension between she and her husband, who's unloading on her, she now starts to unload on one of the kids. Hey, why are you watching TV? Don't you have homework to do? Go do your homework. And now she's created anxiety in this child who was enjoying television and now is, being yelled at when, they thought watching TV was okay in that moment. That's how you triangle someone in and pass anxiety on to a third party. The differentiated mom, however, would recognize what's happening with dad and instead say, honey, um, I know you're upset. It looks like you're really upset, had a rough day. Can you wait until after we've had dinner and put the kids away, and I'll gladly hear you out on whatever you need to talk about. That's how the differentiated mom would handle it. She didn't let emotion dictate her behavior, but on her values and principles, which is we need to keep peace in the house. Dad has brought in a storm. Let's calm the storm just long enough so we can deal with it later. So that fused mom, however, strangled in the child who now carries the anxiety of this conflict between mom and dad. And if this isn't corrected somewhere along the line, one of the principles of anxiety is it begins to increase over time. And this child now starts to begin to carry all sorts of nonsense from home. And, this would be terrible for this child's future relationships and all sorts of stuff. So
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
let's translate this to America socially. Um, one example that I gave was, when COVID happened, and the president at the time said, "Oh yeah, this will just blow away." Well, it didn't blow away. It kept getting worse. Nothing was being done. And so rather than say, we underestimated this problem, here's what we're going to do to solve it, that's what the differentiated president would have said. Instead, this president was fused and said, well, it was China's fault. They're the ones who released it. They gave us the Kung flu, and starts to use racial, epithets and insults and all that kind of stuff. That's a perfect example of fusing on a social level. And so in a city, for example, in a community where companies have left, there are very few resources left, a differentiated mayor will gather all the leaders in the community. What can we do to bring back jobs or to create new jobs or to do something that will take care of our community? A fused mayor is one who will begin to blame, well, it's those immigrants taking our jobs.
Right. Yeah. So
And
you see this
so,
happening all the time in politics. You see it with
yeah,
parents. You'll have one parent where they'll have the favored child where they're enmeshed, and then maybe this is the mom, and then you'll have the dad that might be enmeshed with another child, and you get all these dynamics, and you blame people in this, and essentially it's blame shifting on
right,
these things. So
right,
now one of the things you talked about in your book also was just kind of the history around race, and talking about Bacon's rebellion, and also just the how the term white got promoted in the United States, and there's the phrase a racial bribe. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and how that ties in as an example of Bowen's theory and triangulation.
absolutely. So one of the things that I talk about in the book with regards to critical race theory is I say, why has it taken such a force? And what I argue basically is that while I find some elements, actually many elements, of CRT to be unsupportable in the long run, that one of the reasons that it has captured the imagination of some is it rightly points out to the fact that there are some systemic issues uh, with regards to race and racial injustice in the United States. And the two primary studies that I relied on was The Color of Law to show discrimination in the area of housing, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, to show how the penal system has been used and the criminal system has been used to systematically discriminate. And one of the things that Michelle Alexander talks about in her book was that Bacon's rebellion was poor white sharecroppers together with black sharecroppers and others standing up to white elites, landowners during that time. This was in colonial America. And the way white elites decided to deal with this issue was to recognize it as a conflict between them and poor whites. And so what they did was they demoted blacks from fellow sharecroppers to slaves and then put poor whites in charge of those slaves. And so this is what Michelle Alexander calls a racial bribe. Harvard Law School professor Derek Bell calls it creating a right of property in whiteness. It is the idea that that the way you quiet these whites is to put them over blacks and use blacks as the scapegoat for the problems in poor white people's lives. And by the way, let me show you a modern example of this problem. Probably one of the, I consider to be one of the best things that came out of the Obama administration was the Affordable Care Act. because for the first time in American history, common Americans, poor Americans had access to health care. Well, what happens is politicians, and with the cooperation of the media, slapped the label Obamacare on it. And what that did was it made it easy for candidates running for president and others to say, look, what Mr. Obama's doing is he is taking away your tax money to give this health care away to immigrants and minorities. And many of these poor whites who had never had health insurance ever in their lives and finally got it under the Obama administration voted for Trump because he promised that he would eliminate Obamacare, not understanding that Obamacare was the Affordable Care Act. And, and so once again, both of those, the modern Bacon's Rebellion, the colonial example, Obamacare, both of those are examples of triangling, in that in the modern example, the Republican Party is at odds with the Democrats over the Affordable Care Act. What do? They triangle in poor whites, but the way they triangle them in is by changing the name of the law to Obamacare, thereby making it seem like it was some kind of liberal taking of taxes, when it was a system put in place to provide many people with health care who'd never had it before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are good examples. And yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, even the term whiteness, wasn't really a term, but before, this era. And, what's happened, and, there's a lot of phrases. So you can kind of have the blame that can happen to, different communities, like what you're saying of, you're blaming people of color, or the Black community on Obamacare, or you also have this over under functioning. A lot of my Black friends, they talk about the conversation that they had to have with their parents whenever they're young, that if you're going to make it in society, you got to be twice as good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an over functioning. That's kind of the definition of over functioning, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that's is to a certain extent how you have to make it in society, but that also becomes a curse, right? You have to overperform at all times, or for other people, they just say, the game's rigged, so I'm going to underperform.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting to me is the same dynamics that you have happening in a family. Like the mom blaming the kids whenever the dad's mad at the mom, or other things. The same type of thing happens politically. And to me, as someone who grew up poor white, in a Black community, in a community that was actually culturally largely Black, African American, to me, what's been surprising is there's just so much natural commonalities among the communities that I grew up in, but there's such societal forces that have tried to force us against each other. So almost all my friends, they grew up like the people they knew were, in all their closest friends, were Black, and it was more around income level. But then as you mature in society tries to force you into these molds.
Yeah.
And, there's multiple layers. I mean, it's how the education system works. It's how higher education works. Higher
Yeah.
education likes to teach about, a racialized society. Well, that's because higher education is controlled by the elites. They don't like to talk about, things around social class and stuff along those lines. Or if they do, they do it in a way that's honestly not going to be helpful.
Right. Right.
So, and it's essentially the divide and conquer strategy,
Oh,
that's happened.
absolutely. And Robert Bellah talks about that in his book Habits of the Heart, where he makes the case that Americans' focus on hyper individualism is what brings many of the problems. And in the book, he talks about the fact that if you really truly look at what's the root of most issues in America, it has nothing to do with race and culture. It has everything to do with class.
Right. Yeah. So, and there's a lot of countries that's how they're more organized. That's where the dividing lines are. But in the U.S., that isn't, where they are. And, with City Vision, we serve, mainly ministries that are serving, low income individuals. And so the the primary issue they're dealing with is class, and that has a big overlap with race. But it's important to kind of recognize this dynamic because you have to actively work against it. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do. Now, let's talk a little bit about emotional triangles in Christians and U.S. politics. So, in obviously this is an overgeneralization, but I think that, let's say this is maybe applies to 50 to 70%, or maybe depending on how you count, of you have this, Republican Party being enmeshed with right evangelicals, and you kind of have this favoritism that happens there. And then you kind of have this cutoff with most non-white Christians. And again, it's not always true, but as a generalization. And then you have the Democratic Party that in many ways can be enmeshed with a lot of non-white Christians. And ultimately, what's happening is for a lot of the ministries that we serve, you have well, let's just start talking about that, and then we can come into the ministries. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've seen this true in the U.S., where you kind of have this combined triangulation, where the Republican Party is going to, not everyone in the Republican Party, but often there's going to be, blaming and, cutoff and things along those lines. But then you also might have enmeshment happening, in both ways. In some ways, you have that dynamic that gets set up with parents. Maybe you could talk about how you've seen that true.
So the way I understand this, I would make the argument that this is true with the sort of extremes in the Christian community. That is, that far right part of the Christian community that is much more Christian nationalist, and I would say evangelical on the one hand, and then those Christians who tend to focus solely on the sort of what they call the social gospel, right? The idea that we're supposed to be helping people, but pay almost no attention to holiness. And so because those sorts of churches tend to focus on politics, on that sort of thing, I would say that you're right in terms of the Republican Party obviously associates itself with that, Christian nationalist evangelical extreme to the exclusion. I mean, many of those in the Republican Party are exactly the type of people who would say, well, racism, there's nothing systematic about racism. It's all individuals. It's individuals doing it. When clearly, just those two books that I mentioned, Color of Law in the area of housing, the new Jim Crow in the area of the penal system, both of those books make strong cases for systematic racism in housing and in the penal system. And so you do have that. And then, of course, on the Democratic side, you do have this enmeshment, this sort of courting of liberal churches to support democratic ideals, but they, of course, would not. They would be cut off from, the more conservative, white evangelical Christian nationalist part of the Christian community. And so you do have, I think, that correct. And I think one of the things that becomes important for sober-minded Christians is to not allow ourselves to be enmeshed with either party, right? One of my favorite sayings that has come across my eyes in the last couple of years has been, I don't belong to the donkey or the elephant, I belong to the lamb. And that's the sort of posture that we need to take. But in order to do that, we really need to get a hold of our emotions and not allow ourselves to become anxious one way or the other. Stay grounded in the word. Stay grounded in the word. That's what will help us to deal with that. But again, I wouldn't deny that we've seen some of this that's on the slide right now play out in American politics. I would probably add to most non-white, liberal white. And again, I wouldn't say just white evangelicals, but those tending toward Christian nationalists. But otherwise, I think it's pretty accurate.
And I think it would be fair to say both of these parts down here, I'm talking about non-differentiated,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're getting at is, these are the non-differentiated. It's people who haven't actually gone through that process. Some of it is like not letting your emotions get manipulated. Some of it is actually, going in the word, like you said. Some of it is actually looking at the data. Like we actually have to look at the data. So if you're going to say something like, um, you know, does the U.S. have a system of discrimination that's resulting in mass incarceration? Well, I've looked at the data, man, it's pretty true, and it's kind of the same type of thing in terms of especially, the history around housing discrimination. The data is pretty compelling. So you have to look at um, you know, what's true and using a multifaceted aspect of, towards that. And
Yeah.
that's how you become more differentiated. So part of the reason why we want to, promote this type of framework is recognizing, what ministry you're in. So about 80 to 90% of our students are Christians, working in at-risk communities. And you kind of have this risk that happens to ministry leaders. And here you have kind of this, community here. It's less educated, poor white males, white rural is this community here. And again, it's going to be those that are undifferentiated. But then often you'll have more educated, women, people of color, LGBTQ over here, and you have a risk over here for rescue missions and what I would call right of center ministry. So we serve a lot of gospel rescue missions, and the
Hmm.
audience they serve, a lot of the audience they serve is this. Not that that's the entire audience, but often that might be close to 50%. And then you have we have worked a lot with Christian community development organizations and our partner with CCDA, and a lot of those are to the left of center, and they're going to have the risk of being kind of following in this dynamic here. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what is your advice. So to be self differentiated individually and culturally. So and you talked a little bit about that at the end of your book. But yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about, what's your advice for people to be this, using this term self-differentiated.
Yeah. So again, I think, reminding people that differentiation is about separating your emotions from your thinking and making decisions based on your principles and values. And so for us as Christian leaders, what that means is we need to, first of all, stand on the word of God, know that word through and through, and embrace it in its fullness. And why do I say that? You know, you have a lot of churches, for example, and most of them tend to be conservative, totally concerned about holiness, um, seem not to be concerned at all about social issues. In fact, if you bring it up, they immediately accuse you of being liberal, all this other stuff. Then you have these churches that have embraced our obligation to bring social justice to the forefront as something that we must do, but they've disregarded holiness. Pastors and Christian leaders have to embrace both sides. It's both. One of the things we just had a conversation in one of our classes where professors were asked to share their uh, ministry philosophy. And for me, it stands on the fact that in John chapter 1, twice, not once, but twice, it says that Jesus came in grace and truth. If you have a church that's all grace and no truth, you have a permissive church. If you have a church that's all truth and no grace, you have a legalistic church. We have to embrace both as we craft programs, strategies, and make decisions about how to address the problems that we find in our respective communities. And this is true about racial justice, but it's also true about, how do we deal with the immigration problem? How do we deal with, um, the mass numbers of divorces having and children growing up in one parent households? How do we deal with the changes in the economy that have been wrought by the increase in technology? All of those things we need to address as church, and we need to address as church, parachurch organizations, but let's do so holistically. And in order to do that, we have got to be differentiated. What does that mean? We can't allow our emotions. For example, we can't take sides. We can't, um, allow, this nationalistic fervor and all of this emotional manipulation that we see on social media. We can't allow that to have a hold on us. We've got to be able to make decisions that are sober minded and then stand on those decisions when the two extremes start to come after us, because they will. When you decide to stand on the word and not on the political agendas, one or both sides will come after you. And part of being differentiated is you've got to be able to stand up to that. Like let me put it in as simple a way as I possibly can. You got to be okay with people hating you. That's
Right.
all there's
Yeah.
to it. But that balance of grace and truth to me is critically important, and a lot of that has to do with leaders not only standing on the word, but I think the other thing I'll add is this: make sure that there's a lot of self-care built into your life. That oftentimes leaders make bad decisions and missteps when they are emotionally, physically, or mentally compromised. And so leaders need to be able to, for example, here's one I constantly get on pastors about. You need to have somebody outside of your church community that you can go have conversations with, and who's not afraid to tell you, bro, you're wrong on this one.
Right.
You need to have, because if you don't have that support system outside, then what happens is, the church or the organization, whatever it is that you're leading, it will drag you down into the worst, into the fused part of the system, rather than staying in the differentiated side.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, stay in the word, stay kind of balanced in your life, stay connected to God. I think those are all foundational. I mean, some of the things I think about, I've read a lot about and learned over life a lot about how people make decisions and how they actually, you know, choose what they believe rather than, they say what they believe. And there's different, books that have talked about this, whether it's, Thinking Fast and Slow or other things. One of the models is The Elephant and the Rider,
Mm-hmm.
where so much of our decision process, and the example of the elephant and the writer is that often we as the writer, that's the conscious self, think that we're in control, but there's this kind of elephant that's dragging us around, and the elephant's going where it is wants to go, and we just make up the reason why the elephant changed directions. And I saw this happen during COVID. I saw it happen during Trumpism. And the reality is, and I saw this happen actually whenever I was a college student, and I left God. I got sexually involved with someone, and I decided that because I got sexually involved, and this is really how my thinking process worked, but I would have never said this. I said I left God because it didn't make sense to me, and I came up with all these rational reasons. But I really left God because I got sexually involved with someone, and then I had to come up with a bunch of excuses for why I did that, right? So, and usually that's how it works, like so the elephant, I got
Right.
dragged somewhere by the elephant, and then I had to come up with excuses, right? So what happens usually, I would say in the studies that I've seen, maybe 80 or 90% of our decision processes is what we do and our community around us,
Mm-hmm.
not what we think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we come out of this enlightenment rationalism, and the reality is, so how do you help address that? Well, I think a big part of that for me over time has been to jump across being a part of different communities. That's one of the CCDA values, but be a part of different communities, because every community, it's the law of cultural original sin. Every culture is tainted, but they're tainted in different ways, and you only get to see how they have, how you're not, the only way you can get avoid being enmeshed in your own culture is if you go and, like they say, a fish can't tell what water is until you've actually left the water, right? So if you go into
Right.
another culture, then you can start to understand, a lot of these things. So, I think that there's a process, so some of it's rational, it's about the Bible, some of it's about being in a community of people who are really seeking God, genuinely, but some of it is there's these cross-cultural dimensions that, you can be in a strong community, but it's, monocultural, you're not going to really differentiate from that culture.
Hmm.
So I think that's a big part of it too. So,
Yeah, I think
and
that's
it,
great advice.
yeah,
I
and
think that's great
it's
advice.
not simple. So, one of the tools that's often used in cross-cultural, is this. It's called Barry's acculturation model, and I'm applying this to, Christians, but really answer two questions. Is it important to maintain one's Christian identity and community? And that's yes or no. And is it important to develop relationships with the larger society? And that's, yes or no, right? So, and if it's not important to maintain your Christian identity and community, and you want to develop relationships with larger society, that's essentially an assimilation
Right.
strategy of secularization. What we're going for is biblical engagement. We want to be in the world, but not of it. So we want to
Right.
maintain our Christian identity and engage with the world. Um, then here, this is marginalization. This is, this group that you are kind of alluding to. They're cultural evangelicals. I grew up being talking, I grew up, in evangelical churches where we judge the cultural Catholics, where, they only went to church a couple times a year. But now there's all these cultural evangelicals, right? Especially
Right.
in the
Right.
Midwest and South, where, evangelical is just a term that you use to describe what the culture is around you, right?
Right.
But you aren't really following the Bible, and if you go to church, you do it either rarely or you're not letting it change you. Um, and so these are cultural evangelicals. And the largest group of evangelicals I saw in a study is evangelicals who don't attend church, which is kind of like a contradiction of terms, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So,
Right. 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 Right.
and so that's it's not important to maintain your Christian identity, and it's not important to develop relationships with larger society. And then you have the separation, so fundamentalism. So, where it's important to maintain one's identity and community. So, you can become, uh, over separated, right? Or you can become enmeshed with the culture. But it's much more difficult to have this biblical engagement and to have that healthy differentiation.
Hmm.
So that's what we're trying to do with our students. It's a long journey. I know that it's extremely difficult. And, part of what I like about you and what you have in your book is, whenever you pursue that kind of third path, you're blending these different things, and people are like, are you a liberal or are you conservative? Or, one of my authors that I like, Randy Alcorn, he talked about it at one point in his church, he had two separate protests going on outside his church. One was by the liberal side, and another one was by the conservative side, and they were protesting on different issues. And I was like, yeah, I think that's sometimes how it works.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's called the radical middle. What I think it is just, you don't go to these norms of all left or all right. You do, the biblical norms. So you're going to weave in and
Right.
out in a lot of ways. So I've really appreciated that. That's what you did in your book. And that's what, I think we're trying to do as Christians. One other thing I'd like to say of why I really like this chapter, the biggest challenge, I think, on conversations on race is to dial it down and to get into a space of empathy. Um,
Mhm.
and um, I think that the framework you're providing is a bridge, because it is much easier to kind of have this empathy if you're thinking about, okay, I've seen triangulation happen in my family, I've seen triangulation happen in work dynamics and church dynamics, and I see the same pattern happening in society, and a lot of the same ways to dismantle that, um, in society are the same ways that you dismantle it, in families. And I think that what that does is it kind of creates this empathy. It can create, good next steps, of, if we're being played against each other in ways that
Mhm.
aren't helpful, which is what happens. A lot of politicians benefit by playing us against each other.
Mhm.
then we understand how do we work to counter that. So, and I think that's really what a good model is useful for is that it provides a framework that's going to help move you towards progress, move you towards God, and move you to a better community. So,
Amen to that,
yeah.
brother.
So thank you so much, and I look forward to having continued conversations around this. So,
Amen.
okay.